This podcast is sponsored by Dubby Energy Drinks. You guys, I have made a lot of questionable decisions in my life, but this is not one of them. Dubby is the best. If you've been searching for a clean alternative to an energy drink, look no further. Dubby is a clean energy drink mixture that's designed to help you feel productive without that nasty crash afterward. It's sugar-free, has no artificial dyes, no nasty fillers, and it's packed with vitamins, amino acids, and all the good stuff that we need to really help with focus. They also use 150 milligrams of caffeine per serving, which for me is the sweet spot where I feel like awake and productive, but not like I just chewed on a power line and I'm about to astral project against my will. And they have so many flavors, guys. They have unique ones like Japanese yuzu, and they even have a s'mores flavor. I also really love that it comes in tubs, so I can just mix it whenever I need it. And it feels a lot smoother and cleaner than traditional energy drinks. My life really loves the element of surprise, and Debbie has been coming through for me to get me through the day. So if you're like me and you've tried everything, but you keep getting disappointed, Debbie is here to save the day. Head on over to Debbie.gg and use my code Suspects10 to save some money and also save your nervous system. That's code Suspects10 at Debbie.gg. Link is in the show notes to get started. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. This is Suspects and Spirits, and I'm your host, Taylor Seraphin. And I gotta say, I love you guys. I love you guys. I don't know how, but we gained a significant amount of coven members and Gouligans this past week, and I'm just blown away. I'm very thankful. I'm very grateful for that, and just really happy to welcome you all to this weird little corner of the interwebs. It's a delightful little slice of spooky up in here, and then there's some murder sprinkled into there. But it's really cool to be building a community with like-minded people who are interested in both the paranormal and also just really fucked up shit that we hate but find interesting at the same time. We don't understand humans, but we are fascinated by them, and we want justice for those whose lives have been taken, and that's why we listen and share these stories. You never know how it could help, or if someone has a new perspective, or if someone listening is currently in a bad situation and sees a story that's similar to theirs and it helps them get out. Anyway, thank you, all you nerds who are tuning in. Love that you're here. Now, I have to change the tone of this quite drastically. And there's really no good segue into our topic today because it's brutal. But before we begin, because we have so many new members, I'd just like to remind you guys, if you would like to leave an offering for the True Crime Coven in Apple review form, it's very much appreciated. Stars are good too. Tap those stars. Just let me know how you're liking the podcast. And also, if you have any crazy, spooky, or harrowing hometown crime stories, send them in for our Booze Clues segment. I do listener stories every other month. So that's the last Friday of every other month, which is this Friday. So tune into that and send in your stories. I'd love to hear them if you got them. Now, we've got to dive in because today we are covering the Keddie Cabin murders. And some of you may know this story. It's pretty infamous, I guess you could say. It even inspired in my opinion, one of the scariest horror films I've ever seen, which is The Strangers. That movie is part of the reason why I never answer my door. And I will never tell anyone if Tamara is home. I don't know, Tamara, get off my porch. But the story itself, the one we're telling today, obviously it's not the Hollywood version. It's really awful. And we have to remember that these were real people and that this affected an actual family and community. But I would also like to mention a trigger warning here at the top. This episode discusses domestic abuse, allegations of sexual abuse, murder, obviously, and just very graphic crime scene details. So listener discretion is advised. Now, let's get started. On the morning of April 12th, 1981, 14-year-old Sheila Sharp walked home from a sleepover in the tiny mountain community of Keddie, California. Sheila expected to come home to the usual scene: sleepy siblings, morning chatter, and the familiar chaos of a house full of kids. But the moment she opened the door to cabin 28, any sense of normalcy disappeared. Sheila was hit by an intense foul odor, and then she saw blood. So much blood. Sheila's mother, 36-year-old Glenna Sue Sharp, known as Sue, had been brutally murdered, along with her 15-year-old brother John, John's 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate, and Sheila's 12-year-old sister Tina was nowhere to be found. But the strangest part of this whole scene was that her two younger brothers, Rick, who was 10, and Greg, who was 5, were sound asleep in the back bedroom, completely unharmed. And with them was their 12-year-old friend Justin, who had spent the night. What followed became one of California's most infamous, unsolved, and highly criticized murder cases. Why so criticized? Well, that's because the police had two perfect suspects and even a potential confession, but no charges or arrests were ever made. To this day, even with DNA evidence, the Keddie Cabin murders remain unsolved. So please, take a seat, fold that laundry, or finish walking your dog and let me know your thoughts at the end, because this story usually comes with a lot of opinions, and I know I have mine. Now, to understand the story, we need to start with the family. So let's start there. Glenna Susan Davis, known throughout her life as Sue, was born on March 29th, 1945 in Springfield, Massachusetts. When she was 20 years old, Sue married James Sharp, who I will be referring to as Jim. A short time later, their first child, John, was born on November 12th, 1965. And about a year later, they had their first daughter, Sheila, and then Tina in 1968, and eventually two younger sons, Rick and Greg. Altogether, Sue and Jim had 5 children. The marriage, however, was deeply troubled. Jim was both emotionally and physically abusive toward his children and Sue. And according to Sheila, the oldest daughter, he had also sexually abused her and her sister Tina. So, really, just a piece of shit. And eventually, Sue decided that she needed to get herself and her children away from him. So, in March of 1980, Sue packed up the kids and left, relocating to California. Initially, Sue and the kids stayed with her brother Don Davis in Quincy while she tried to figure out how to support 5 children on her own. Money was extremely tight, as you can imagine, but like most moms, she was going to do whatever it took to raise her children. At the time of the move, Sue's only source of income was a small military-related stipend from her marriage to Jim, who had been in the Navy. And this was only about $250 monthly, which is like nothing, especially when you have 5 kids to raise. So because of this, Sue was also receiving public assistance. Thankfully, though, she did eventually find work at the Elks Lodge in Quincy, California, and even enrolled part-time at the Feather River College, where she studied typing and business. This was also a great opportunity for her because it provided her with an additional student stipend. So, needless to say, Sue was doing the damn thing. She was really working hard, just trying to raise her kids. But even with the new stream of income, she was still having a hard time finding a place that she could afford to live with 5 children. But then, in November of 1980, she found somewhere that she could afford, and that was in the small town of Keddie, California. Keddie is located in Plumas County, which is in the Sierra Nevada region of Northern California. So it's not far from Quincy, where she had found work and was going to school. Historically, the community of Keddie had been connected to the railroad, but by the time Sue and her children arrived, Keddie's population had declined dramatically. Because the railroad that had once sustained the community was no longer operating, there were only about 60 people living there at the time. So attempts had been made to sort of like reinvent Keddie as a resort destination, but eventually some of the resort cabins became affordable housing. So for Sue, that made Keddie an incredible opportunity. She and her children moved into cabin 28. It was small, maybe like 1,000 square feet at the most, but after everything the family had gone through, it offered them something far more important than space. And that was just the safety to exist in their own home, which honestly makes this story even more heartbreaking. The cabin had 2 bedrooms on the main level and then a basement room with its own exterior entrance. So Sue shared 1 bedroom with Sheila and Tina, and then Rick and Greg shared the other bedroom, and 15-year-old John slept downstairs in the basement. Now, because John's room had a separate entrance and he needed access to the kitchen and the bathroom upstairs, the family reportedly had a habit of leaving the main cabin accessible to him, so they would leave it unlocked. And in a community as small as Keddie, leaving a door unlocked was not necessarily considered reckless, especially in 1981. I don't even think we locked our doors all the time growing up in Sierra Vista. And it was significantly bigger than Keddie, but still a small town. My friends they would just come over. Some of them would ring the doorbell first, but others would just walk in. That was when we lived in town near the elementary school. But when we moved out to Hereford, we were right next to the highway and a bar. So we locked the door often. Small towns, no one locks their doors. I could never this day and age, just could not. I'm so paranoid. I will triple check our doors at night. It's like Fort Knox up in this bitch. I don't play. But back then, it was the norm, especially in the 80s and the before times. I'd also like to point out though that this community where the Keddie cabins are located, it is extremely isolated. So not only did it have a small population, but it was only accessible by a single road. It wasn't like off a main road somewhere. This was a community that people really only entered if they lived there or they were visiting someone for some reason. Now, the Sharp children also quickly developed friendships with neighboring kids and other cabins nearby. And one of the closest families was the Seabolt family who lived in cabin 27, so like 100 feet away. They had two daughters, Alyssa and Paula, and a son named James who went by Jamie. Sheila and Tina had become really close with the Seabolt girls and would often go over there to watch TV and hang out. And then there was the Smart family who lived in cabin 26. The Smart family consisted of Marilyn Smart, her husband Martin, aka Marty Smart, and her children, including their 12-year-old son, Justin, Marty's stepson. Justin had become really good friends with Greg and Rick Sharp, and that friendship between the Smart family and the Sharps would become very important because, as you may remember from the beginning, Justin was one of the 3 survivors in cabin 28, which has led to a lot of speculation over the years. But before we get there, let's go back in time to Saturday, April 11th, 1981. The day before the crime was discovered. That day started out normally enough. Sue and Sheila went into nearby Quincy to do some shopping, and at some point that afternoon, Sue encountered her son John and his 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate. Dana and John were very close. They were best friends, and while some accounts describe Dana as having a reputation for getting into trouble, he was a regular presence in John's life. And Sue she really liked that John had someone to spend time with. And I mean, I think we've all had that friend, or maybe you were that friend at some point. I like to think of Dana as the Sean Hunter here. John is Corey, Dana is Sean. He gets into trouble, but she can't help but love him. So that afternoon, John and Dana had decided that they wanted to go to Quincy. And I guess they asked Sue if they could go into town. And she told the boys, yes. She was like, yeah, you can go, but please don't hitchhike. Like, don't hitchhike into town. And they were like, sure, we promise we won't hitchhike. But then what did they do? They hitchhiked, of course. So John and Dana spent part of that evening at a party around Quincy and Oakland Camp area. And they were reportedly seen later that night attempting to find transportation back toward Keddie. Unfortunately, exactly when they finally arrived back at cabin 28 would become one of the unresolved pieces of the night's timeline. Meanwhile, back in Keddie, Rick and Greg had their friend Justin, aka the Smart son, over for the night, while Sheila and Tina had gone over to the Seabolt family cabin to watch TV with their daughters Alyssa and Paula. Sheila had planned to sleep there, and Tina apparently wanted to stay as well, but sometime between like 9 and 10 p.m., Tina decided to return home to their cabin. And that decision is heart-wrenching in hindsight, because had she stayed with Sheila that night, this entire story may be different. So now at this point, tucked into cabin 28 were Sue, the mother, 12-year-old Tina, 10-year-old Rick, 5-year-old Greg, and 12-year-old Justin. And then at some point throughout the night, John and Dana returned to the cabin. The following morning, around 7:45 a.m., Sheila woke at the Seabolt's home. She gathered her things and walked the short distance back to cabin 28 like she had done so many times before. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to walk into. And when Sheila opened that door to cabin 28, it was a bloodbath. There were pools of blood all over the cabin, and then she discovered the bodies. There in the cabin were her brother John, her mother Sue, and John's best friend Dana. The three victims had been bound and were lying in the living room. Sheila's memories of what happened next are pretty fragmented, as one might imagine. She would later say that she knew it was her brother John laying in the living room, but didn't really recognize him in that moment. Much of what she saw that morning is something she says she has intentionally blocked out. What she does remember is running back toward the Seabolt's cabin, screaming for help after discovering the bodies, which, I mean, at 14 years old, I don't know what else you would do. That's so traumatic. So once Sheila got to the Seabolt's cabin, they immediately went to phone for help. They themselves did not have a phone in their cabin, so the adults went to find a phone to contact authorities, while their son Jamie went to cabin 28 to try and determine if anyone was still alive, which unfortunately meant that the crime scene had already been contaminated before investigators could even secure it. Not that they did in this case, but we'll get there. But I mean, Jamie, he was a kid and he was just trying to help. So Jamie reportedly checked Sue and John and Dana for signs of life, but they were very much gone at this point. Then, realizing that there were only three people, he actually went outside the cabin. He went around to look through a window into the back bedroom to check for the other children. And inside the bedroom were Rick, Greg, and Justin sleeping peacefully and very much alive. Now, of course, Jamie did not want the boys to see the scene in the living room, so he removed them through the bedroom window. He opened it and he got them out that way. And from what everyone could gather, the three boys appeared to have been in such a deep sleep that they were completely unaware of what had happened just feet away from them in the living room, which, considering the brutality of the crime scene and the small size of the cabin, was really difficult to comprehend. Law enforcement arrived shortly after 8 a.m., and Sue's brother Don was also notified and asked to identify the victims. The scene was reportedly so disturbing that Don had difficulty remaining inside long enough to even identify anyone. But eventually, the identities were confirmed to be Sue, John, and Dana. But investigators realized that even with the younger boys who had survived, they still had not accounted for every member of the Sharp family. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing. So they searched the crime scene for any signs of Tina. And just a heads up, the detail of this scene it's extremely disturbing. We're going to get into what they found as they were searching. As I mentioned before, Sue, John, and Dana had all been restrained. They were found bound in the living room. John and Dana had been bound with electrical cords, and Sue's restraints were particularly tight. The blood associated with her bindings and injuries suggested that she had struggled quite a bit and definitely fought back. So this was not an easy, quick attack by any means. Sue had defensive wounds, and John and Dana reportedly did not show the same evidence of defending themselves, which raised the possibility that they had already been restrained or otherwise incapacitated before some of their fatal injuries were inflicted. Sue was found nude from the waist down and was partially covered with a blood-soaked yellow blanket. Her mouth had been gagged using her own underwear and a bandana, which were secured with medical tape. And despite how she was found, investigators did not establish that Sue had been sexually assaulted. Sue's hands and feet had been bound, and she had suffered stab wounds to her chest. Her throat had been deeply cut. She had been strangled, and she had also suffered significant blunt force injuries to her head. One of those injuries was consistent with being struck by the butt of a Daisy pellet rifle, so a BB gun. The rifle itself was reportedly not recovered at the scene, but components or, pellets associated with a weapon of that kind were found, contributing to the investigators' belief that a BB gun may have been used as a club during the attack. This scene, you guys, it is so fucking awful. It's just so hateful and rage-filled. To strangle someone is already a very long and very personal crime. And when you combine that with the blunt force trauma, being bound and gagged and also stabbed, I mean, my God, that's a lot of rage. Two bloodied knives were also recovered at the scene, and one of them had been bent, you guys. bent severely enough that investigators believed that the force used during the stabbing had damaged the blade, which is insane. I don't know if you've ever tried to bend metal, but it's not easy. So that really paints quite the picture. There was also a bloody claw hammer that was found inside the cabin. John had also suffered very severe injuries. His throat had been cut, like Sue's, and he had sustained severe blunt force trauma to his head as well, which was consistent with being struck with a hammer or similar object. Dana also suffered extensive blunt force trauma and had been strangled. Investigators believed at least two different hammers may have been used during the attack, but only one was recovered inside cabin 28. Blood spatter reportedly reached surfaces around the room, and investigators believe that the attacks themselves occurred there rather than the bodies being moved into the room afterward. And there was another extremely strange detail. Blood was reportedly found on the bottoms of Sue's feet and on the soles of the boys' shoes and socks, which suggests that at some point during the sequence of events, the victims may have moved through the blood that was already present in the cabin. If that interpretation is correct, it complicates the timeline considerably. Someone may have been injured while others were still alive and mobile. The victims may have been forced to move, or the attack may have unfolded in stages. I mean, we really don't know how any of this went down. And investigators also found blood on the doorknob leading toward the bedroom where the surviving boys had been sleeping, almost like someone went to check on them during the attack, but then was interrupted or grabbed and brought back into the living room. And then the cabin's telephone was off the hook. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, but that's less mysterious than it initially sounds because the Sharp family was known to leave the cabin unlocked, like I mentioned before. But still, it meant investigators could not determine from a broken lock or a damaged door exactly how the killer or killers entered. And I say killers because there really is no way that one person could have done this on their own. I mean, I guess anything's possible, but I personally believe that there were, at the very least, two attackers. And as far as forensics go, it was the 80s, so nothing could really be done at the time. But a bloody fingerprint was reportedly recovered from a railing near the rear exit. Another interesting detail is that the lights were off and the shades were drawn when the scene was discovered. All of those details led investigators to attempts to reconstruct not only who had done this, but the order in which everything had happened. Had someone entered carrying the BB gun and used it to control everyone, almost acting like it was a real gun, trying to get them to comply? Were they restrained first? Was someone attacked while others were forced to watch? Did John and Dana interrupt the attack that was already underway? Or did the killers know that they would be there? And why were the three boys in the back bedroom spared? Thank God they were, but it just makes you wonder if there was a reason, because you wouldn't really leave a witness after this sort of crime. I guess kids could sleep through something like that. It's possible. My oldest could sleep through a damn war, but my youngest will wake up if you breathe wrong in her direction. So the chances of all three of those boys sleeping through that scene it's really, I want to say it's slim, because were all of them deep sleepers? Kids are all different. But when initially questioned, Rick, Greg, and Justin did not describe hearing the massacre occurring in the living room, which has understandably become one of the most baffling elements of this case. This scene paints a very loud picture. I don't imagine that this was a quiet attack. People were being struck repeatedly. Furniture and bodies were moving. There's blood smears and blood on their feet that show that they were moving around. I'm sure that there was groaning and noises being made or demands being made as well. Three people were bound. A knife was used with enough force to bend its blade. Sue had defensive wounds, so obviously she fought back, and all of this happened inside a relatively small cabin. It's seriously like maybe 800 to 1,000 square feet. It is not big at all. And there actually is some evidence that the night may not have been completely silent, because a couple living nearby reportedly told investigators that sometime around 1 a.m., they heard what sounded like muffled screaming or groaning. They weren't exactly sure where it was coming from, and apparently they didn't investigate any further. I guess they thought it was a TV that was left on or something, but I don't know. Me personally, if I hear noises like that, I'm calling the police. I don't care. I'll overreact every time if it means helping someone. And the fact that they said that they heard this around 1 a.m. to 1:30, it does sort of give us at least a possible window for part of the attack. And let me be clear, this is in no way, shape, or form their fault. Okay, it's the murderer's fault. Should they have maybe checked it out? Yeah, but definitely not their fault what happened. So as I mentioned before, none of the boys reported seeing or hearing anything initially. And when investigators began speaking more extensively with Justin, Justin's story became a little more complicated. And finally, he said that he did actually remember something. Justin originally described what he remembered as like a dream. He thought he had dreamt it. And investigators eventually used hypnosis in an attempt to recover additional memories from Justin. And while that decision has to be viewed very cautiously because hypnosis is not a reliable method of extracting objective memories, we still have to consider it when telling this story. But Justin's account is very interesting. He described two men attacking Sue, John, and Dana. And then he mentioned there being a stabbing and a hammer. He also described John and Dana arguing with the two men. But most importantly, he described Tina Sharp emerging from the bedroom. Remember, Tina is still missing, and no one has any idea where she is or if she's safe. But according to Justin's account, one of the men grabbed Tina and took her out through the back of the cabin. Justin also described attempting to help Sue by placing towels against her wounds and eventually covering her with a blanket, which we cannot confirm, but it could account for why she was covered because these men who did this, they were not the kind to cover her up if they were going to leave her there in that state. I know it happens in some sexual assaults and murders, but this was not that. So, I mean, it could make sense that he woke up, thought he was dreaming, went to try and help or cover her. But I don't know. That's a really traumatic scene. But I mean, some of those details did understandably catch investigators' attention because Justin also provided physical descriptions of the two men. And so composite sketches were eventually created. And one of the men was described as taller with lighter or dark blonde hair, and the other was shorter with darker hair. Accounts of the descriptions include both men wearing gold framed glasses or sunglasses. Yes, sunglasses at night, which is important. And eventually, the people looking at those sketches began noticing something. One of them looked an awful lot like Justin's own stepfather, Marty Smart. And as I mentioned before, Marty was married to Marilyn, and they lived in cabin 26 with Justin. Marty was a Vietnam veteran, and according to those who knew him best, Marty was described as a man with some serious anger problems and violent behavior. And even Marilyn, his wife, said that he was physically abusive and that their marriage was deteriorating. Now, here's the interesting part. When they met Sue Sharp, when her and her kids, moved into the cabin nearby, she and Marilyn became really good friends. And Sue sort of inserted herself and her opinions onto their marriage because Sue herself had escaped an abusive marriage less than a year earlier. So she was urging Marilyn to leave him. She was like, "You gotta leave Marty. This is not safe." And according to the theory investigators would later focus on, if Marty knew about those conversations, Sue may have represented a threat to his control over his marriage. Now, it's also reported that Marilyn found out about an affair that Marty was having, so that did not help his case. I'd leave that man too. But aside from Marty, remember there were two composite sketches made, and so there had to be another suspect, which brings us to Bo. During this time, John Beatty, I think is how you pronounce it, referred to as Bo, was staying with the Smarts at the time. Marty had reportedly met Bo through a veteran's medical setting, and Bo subsequently came to stay with Marty and Marilyn. Now, Bo here had a criminal history, and later accounts have associated him with organized crime, specifically the mafia. But the mafia don't typically kill their children. And when you think about what was done to Sue, that wasn't my initial thought. However, He had ties to it. Doesn't mean he was in it, just that he was known to be involved in some way or another. But what matters more is that Bo was in Keddie with Marty on April 11th, and Marilyn would later give a very interesting account of their behavior that night. Sometimes staring at screens all day can make your eyes feel like they are actually on fire. And let's face it, in today's world, a lot of what we do requires staring at a screen, which is already horrible for your eyes. I actually went to the eye doctor recently and he was like, Wow, I didn't think it was possible, but your vision has gotten worse." Rude, but true. So, of course, he started asking me all the normal questions about headaches and screen time, like I'm a toddler whose parents don't monitor how many episodes of Bluey they consume. And I'm explaining my daily life, lesson planning, entering grades, researching cases, recording episodes, editing episodes, dog videos, more dog videos. And he's like, Yeah, you need a new prescription and you should probably invest in some blue light blocker glasses." Now, since I am a contact lens girly and always have been, I did not want to pay the extra price for blue light glasses that I would never wear. So I did what we all do. I went to Amazon. And that's where I found Any Love blue light glasses, which have really helped me on my not wanting my eyes to feel like they're on fire journey. In fact, I'm wearing them right now. So if your eyeballs are also filing a formal complaint and possibly your eye doctor too, head to my link in the show notes and grab yourself some Any Love glasses. They have tons of different styles for men and women. They're honestly super cute and they even come with a nice little case. Save your eyes some stress and go grab a pair or two or five because your eyeballs deserve it. One thing people ask me all the time is how I make my podcast merch, and I always, always, always send them over to Printful. In fact, I've officially partnered with them because they do such an incredible job. Seriously, you guys, they are such a game changer. It's so easy, I could do it. Printful is a print-on-demand site where you design your merch exactly the way you want it, and they create it for you when someone clicks that purchase button. So you're not stuck storing boxes upon boxes of shirts, hats, stickers, or random inventory in your house. The best part is that you can link your Printful creations directly to your very own website. I just design what I want and they take care of the rest. They print it, pack it, and ship it for me. And you can set your own prices. And the merch options, endless. The limit does not exist. We're talking everything from cozy sweaters to phone cases and even adorable pet accessories for your furry little friends. They'll love it. So if you've ever wanted to start a side hustle or just bring a creative idea to life and slap it on a t-shirt or a good old dad hat, this is hands down the easiest way to do it without the stress. Head over to printful.com/a/suspects to let them know I sent you and get that creative juice a-flowing. The link is in the show notes to get started. Again, that's printful.com/a/suspects to let them know I sent you. According to Marilyn, she spent part of the evening with Marty and Bo at Keddie's backdoor bar. She said that Marty and Bo got unusually dressed up before heading out, which was odd because this was like a local dive bar, not a fancy place. Marilyn later mentioned that both men went to the bar wearing a suit and tie. They had sunglasses. And she also later claimed that Bo made a really disturbing comment that evening about feeling like killing someone. So, Bo's not all right. Eventually, though, Marilyn returned home, but Marty and Bo went back out. Marilyn later said that when she woke during the early morning hours, she saw Marty and Bo near the wood stove. She believed that they were burning something, but she couldn't tell what it was. It has been speculated by many since this crime that Marty and Bo dressed this way to sort of draw attention to themselves and secure an alibi. Like, hey, look at us. We're at a bar and we're dressed nice. Everyone will remember that we were here and not at Cabin 28. That's just a theory. It's alleged, as they say. So after hearing Marilyn's account of that night, investigators did question both Marty and Bo, and how they did it has been heavily criticized. This is the part where I just lose all respect for the officers in this particular case. The Plumas County Sheriff, Doug Thomas, he was the one overseeing the investigation. And rather than questioning Marty and Bo separately, he and the investigators decided, oh, it's just Marty and Bo. Let's interview them together. Like, When, someone please tell me, when has that ever been okay? When has that ever been protocol? This is an extraordinarily fucking dumb decision for a triple, possibly quadruple homicide investigation involving two potential connected suspects. You should always separate suspects. Like, what even is this? Separating them allows investigators to compare their stories and identify contradictions. It's actually helpful. Interviewing them together can allow them to hear and adapt to one another's answers and really just like feed off of each other. That's the dumbest shit I ever heard. But they did that. So during questioning, Bo reportedly made claims about his past. Marty also made several strange statements. At one point, he even suggested that Justin, his stepson, could not have witnessed the murders without himself noticing the boy. He was like, yeah, Justin, he couldn't have witnessed what was going on without me noticing that he witnessed what was happening. Which, like, yes, he could have. That is so dumb. But then Marty also told investigators that he had actually seen suspicious men at the bar who resembled himself and Bo. He was like, yeah, it wasn't us, but it was weird because there were these guys who looked up to no good and they looked exactly like us. It was crazy. So that's awfully convenient for them. And then there was the comment about the hammer. So Marty volunteered information at this point that one of his hammers was missing. And because investigators already believed hammers had been used to beat Sue, John, and Dana, along with the BB gun, this was an odd thing to bring up if you don't know anything about the crime and had been out all night and then just went straight home. Like, when did you go looking for your hammer? Why would you go looking for your hammer in the middle of the night? And why would you know that it's missing? But Marty described the missing hammer, and the investigators did not try to recover it. They were like, oh, wow, that's wild. Yep. Well, we haven't seen it. So that's that. And Marty was eventually given a polygraph examination and he passed. But as we know, polygraphs do not scientifically establish innocence. They measure, physiological responses, and they're just not reliable enough to function as a definitive proof that someone is, being honest. So this wasn't actually helpful. And in the end, Marty and Bo were not charged. They were not looked into any further because the police were like, hey, we know these guys. Even if they did it, no, they didn't. It's just the fucking good old boys club, you know? So, with no charges brought onto either one of them, within weeks, both men left the area. Yep, just left the state. They were like, bye. That's not suspicious. Not weird at all. Bo returned to Illinois and Marty eventually moved to Oregon, and neither would ever face prosecution for the Keddie murders. I would like to point out that Marty and Bo were not the only people investigators considered. Sue's estranged husband, Jim, was an obvious early person to investigate because of the history of abuse and the circumstances of their separation. So investigators did look into his whereabouts, but ultimately determined that he had an alibi, and he was eliminated as a suspect. Rumors also circulated that the murders were somehow connected to drugs, and one claim suggested that Dana had stolen LSD from a local drug dealer and that the murders represented retaliation. But no evidence has ever established that theory. Other rumors attempted to connect Sue to the drugs or to sex work, but again, investigators did not find evidence supporting those claims, and Sheila, her daughter, strongly rejected them. She was like, yeah, my mom was not into any of that, and even if she was, it doesn't make her any less of a victim. There were also theories involving ritualistic murder or trafficking, but those theories have, again, they lack evidence to substantiate them. Those have become more part of like the mythology surrounding Keddie, the lore, rather than actual fact. And we know how that goes. As for other witnesses, investigators did also examine a teacher in town who reportedly had an unusual interest in Tina. And by unusual interest, I mean he was a creep and should have been thrown in jail. The man, if we can call him that, was investigated and later had a, quote, unrelated legal problem involving a child. So investigators determined that he had an alibi for the night of the Keddie murders, and they did not establish a physical connection to Cabin 28. I have a lot of opinions about that. But years later, investigators did consider a potential serial killer for this crime. Basically, anyone other than Marty and Bo. So they decided that this could be related to Robert Joseph Silveria Jr., sometimes called the Boxcar Killer. And if you know anything about that case, then you know Silveria confessed to numerous killings and at one point reportedly claimed responsibility for Keddie. But he was incarcerated when the murders occurred, so he could not have committed them. He just really liked attention, as most of those guys do. Meanwhile, none of these theories answered the most urgent question in April of 1981. And that question was, where was Tina? Tina Sharp was still missing. A small amount of blood was reportedly found on her bedding after the murders, so they launched a large search in the area surrounding Keddie. Dogs were brought in, the FBI became involved, posters carrying Tina's photograph were distributed. Investigators and everyone else really initially had to consider the possibility that she was alive. Maybe Tina had escaped, maybe someone had abducted her and she was being held somewhere. But if she had been specifically taken while everyone else was killed or spared, investigators had to ask whether Tina had actually been the target or, just like why? What was the purpose? Now, another theory, another possibility was that Sue had been the target and Tina just was a witness. She witnessed something she was not supposed to see. Sheila herself believed that her mother had been the primary target. Perhaps someone entered expecting John to be downstairs or away, or maybe they expected Tina to be sleeping at the Seabolts with Sheila. Maybe the situation inside cabin 28 just spiraled when people who were not supposed to be there appeared. But for almost 3 years, none of those questions had answers. But then, in 1984, a man walking through the woods approximately 100 miles from Keddie made a horrifying discovery. On April 22nd, 1984, 3 years and 11 days after the murders, a man named Ronald Pedrini was collecting bottles and cans near Camp 18 in Butte County when he encountered what appeared to be human remains, along with a child's blanket, a blue jacket, Levi jeans, and a medical tape dispenser. Remember, medical tape was used in the murders. And among the remains were portions of a skull and jaw. So, of course, authorities were contacted, and at first they didn't know whose remains they had found. Remember, this is the 80s. They couldn't really do any sort of testing. But then something really weird happened. The Butte County Sheriff's Office received an anonymous telephone call within days of finding these remains, and the male caller mentioned how those remains could be connected to the young girl who had disappeared in the Keddie Cabin murders a few years ago, Tina Sharp, which is sort of wild. This 3 years later, human remains had just been discovered roughly 100 miles from Keddie. And before they were even formally identified, someone is now apparently calling law enforcement and specifically naming a 12-year-old girl who had been involved earlier. It is bizarre, one might say. One might also say that someone guilty of this crime called it in because, well, they like to do those things. So investigators recorded the call, and then somehow that recording just disappeared. It disappeared into the case material for decades. Yeah, they did nothing with it, just sat there. Eventually, though, dental records did confirm what the anonymous caller had already suggested. The remains belonged to 12-year-old Tina Sharp. Yeah. Investigators believed she had probably died relatively soon after being taken from Keddie. So now, Sue, John, and Dana's murders were officially connected to the death of a fourth victim. This was a quadruple homicide. The surviving Sharp children, Sheila, Rick, and Greg, initially had to move out of state to live with an aunt during all of this. But because the aunt already had a really large family, the children were later placed into foster care, staying together at first before eventually being separated, which is awful and happens far too often. And for Sheila in particular, the case never really disappeared. This for her was not something that happened in her past and she just moved on quietly. She was the one who found them. So she continued pushing for answers and seeking justice, but the investigation stalled. And Bo, Marty's buddy, who had been with him the night of the murders but not at home, died in Chicago in 1988. So, pretty soon after what had happened. And Marty died in Portland in 2000. So, if either man knew what happened inside Cabin 28, the opportunity to interrogate them is now gone. And trust me, there was plenty of reason to question them. Cabin 28 itself became a destination for curiosity seekers, paranormal investigators, true crime enthusiasts. Here we are talking about it. But eventually, the structure deteriorated and it was condemned in 2004. Cabin 28 was demolished, but the evidence did not disappear with it. In 2010, Greg Hagwood became sheriff of Plumas County, and Greg had been 16 years old when the murders occurred, and he'd actually known the members of the Sharp family personally. So for him, this was not over. He had not forgotten them, and this case had always bothered him. So under his administration, investigators began taking another serious look at the Keddie murders. Thousands of pages of old investigative material were reviewed. Boxes of evidence were reopened, and investigators began discovering things that made them question how thoroughly certain leads had originally been pursued. An investigator, Mike Gamberg, became instrumental in that renewed investigation. One of the many discoveries that were made involved Marty Smart and a counselor associated with the VA. According to later investigators, the counselor reported that Marty had made incriminating statements during therapy concerning the murders. Accounts of precisely what Marty allegedly admitted to vary quite a bit, so this needs to be stated carefully. But the important point is that investigators reviewing this case decades later believed that this information provided by the counselor should have received far more attention in 1981 than it did. But thankfully and frustratingly, that was not the only forgotten piece of evidence. Investigators eventually recovered a copy of a letter that Marty had written to Marilyn shortly after the murders. It was postmarked only days after the killings. Marty was trying to reconcile with his life in this letter, but he didn't do a very good job. Instead, he incriminated himself even further in that letter. He essentially complained to Marilyn in writing that he had already paid for Marilyn's love with, quote, 4 people's lives, only for her to end their relationship anyway. Again, I say, 4 people's lives. That statement by itself is enough for me. I am not a detective. I don't play one on TV, but I feel like that is considered a confession. However, according to the police at the time, it did not legally prove that Marty murdered anyone, and nothing was done with this letter, even after Marilyn confirmed that the handwriting was Marty's. Now, she did mention that she did not remember receiving this letter, so it's possible that it never got to her. But now, suddenly, this was not just a theory built around an angry husband whose wife's friend had encouraged her to leave him for being a piece of shit. Now, there was a written statement from that man referring to 4 lost lives days after. And then investigators found something else. Remember the hammer that Marty told investigators was missing? More than 3 decades later, in 2016, a man using a metal detector around the pond near Keddie discovered a hammer. Initially, he did not realize that, its potential significance, because, why would you? It's 2016. So he discarded it back into the water. But I will say he did do the right thing later on, because after learning more about what happened at Cabin 28 and the missing hammer, he contacted authorities about it. And so investigators returned to the area and recovered it. And according to investigators, it matched the description of Marty's missing hammer, including characteristics of its handle. Because remember, he described it for some reason. So while it allegedly doesn't prove that it belonged to Marty and allegedly was probably not thrown out there by Marty, it was pretty bizarre, pretty weird. However, after decades underwater, this really degraded potential biological evidence. It was pretty challenging to extract any kind of forensic evidence here. But authorities did send the rusty hammer to the FBI forensic lab for analysis, though nothing has ever come of it. Now, during this renewed review of the case, investigators also rediscovered a copy of the anonymous telephone call made after Tina's remains were found. The recording was submitted to the FBI for forensic audio analysis. Publicly, the identity of the caller has never been conclusively established, but its existence creates one of the most compelling unanswered questions in this entire case. How did that caller know? Like, was it just a really good guess? Were they like, oh, I heard the police discovered human remains? Had no idea if it was a child, no idea if it was skeletal. I'm just trying to wrap my head around this because honestly, that's a really isolated area. And because there was a serial killer who, I mean, it's California, first of all, in the 80s, it could have been anyone. It's California in the 80s. Do you know how many psychopaths were out there just wreaking havoc among the people, leaving bodies? Like, it could have been anyone. How did this person make this connection? Did someone recognize, like, clothing or know something about the area and then mention it to this person who then called it in? The frustrating part is we may never know that answer. The only answers we've really gotten in recent years have to do with other DNA evidence found. And as we know now, modern forensic science offers something that investigators in 1981 didn't have, and that's DNA profiling. So, evidence preserved from Cabin 28 could now potentially be examined in ways that would have been impossible at the time of the murders. And in 2018, investigators announced a very important development. DNA recovered from the medical tape associated with the crime scene reportedly matched a known living male suspect. Living. Now, authorities, they did not publicly identify that person that we know of. And that distinction is extremely important because it doesn't automatically mean that Marty and Bo were innocent. Like I said before, this was not an easy task. It would not have been easy to subdue, bound, and kill two strong teenage boys and their mother while three kids and potentially their 12-year-old sister slept in the back room. No, multiple people could have been involved, more than two easily. The DNA could belong to someone whose role was different from the actual killers, but without knowing precisely where the DNA was located, how it was deposited, whose profile it matched, and what investigators know about that individual, we cannot responsibly turn it into a definitive theory. But it does mean that even decades later, Cabin 28 was still giving investigators information. At one point during the renewed investigation, authorities indicated that several living people remained of interest, which means this is not necessarily a mystery in which everyone capable of providing answers is dead. I mean, it was the 80s. It wasn't 100 years ago. These people are still alive. Well, except for Marty and Bo, conveniently. So things could change, and I fully believe that this could be solved someday. So I'm happy that these guys reopened the case. I mean, I'm sure it feels very personal for them, being a teenager at the time, knowing the family. Of course, you want answers. This scene was not secured at all originally. It was entered by civilians before police arrived. Questions have been raised about evidence preservation. Important information apparently was not followed up on. Marty and Bo were questioned together. Marty volunteered information about his hammer, but was never charged or even looked into because apparently he was friends with the sheriff on the case, Doug Thomas. I guess they knew each other and they were buddies, so that's never been an issue with law enforcement or anything. Also, the therapist information from the VA apparently went nowhere. But then, for me, the biggest thing was that there was a bloody jacket that Marilyn discovered in her basement of their cabin. And she said it belonged to Tina. Like, I'm sorry. How was that not important information? How was that not looked into further? Marilyn later said that she gave it to the investigators, but now it can't be accounted for in the surviving evidence. So where did it go? No wonder the investigators who reopened the case and Sheila are so frustrated with how portions of the original investigation had been handled. Like, what a shitty job those guys did. And I'm sorry. But you cannot convince me that they did any of that by accident. Like, come on. Those are legitimate reasons to criticize the investigation. And when you keep coming across cases like this, it's disheartening to know that the people in charge are making such mistakes or potentially covering things up. And I mean, it's always been this way. But there's a huge difference between an investigation being poorly handled and law enforcement deliberately covering up a quadruple murder. And I'm saying that allegedly. One of the strongest theories, though, and the one that I personally agree with, is that Sue may have been the intended target because she was encouraging Marilyn to leave an abusive marriage. And Marty and potentially another person, aka Bo, allegedly, could have gone to cabin 28 intending to confront Sue, but then John and Dana were either there or they arrived unexpectedly, and at some point the confrontation became violent. The victims were restrained, Sue fought back, John and Dana were killed as well. Then, if and when Tina appeared, if Justin's account contains a genuine memory underneath that dream imagery and hypnosis, Tina may have entered the room during the attack, seen the killers, and then was taken elsewhere to get rid of the last witness. Unlike Rick, Greg, and Justin, who, remember, was Marty's stepson. But nothing happened to him or those boys because Marty was trying to get his wife to stay with him. And that's why he was confronting Sue in the first place, right? So he knew that if he hurt Justin, Marilyn was going to leave him regardless. Like, that's her baby. So he knew he couldn't hurt Justin. And if Justin did see anything, Marty was a known asshole. He was abusive. He could easily have scared Justin into not saying anything. So I find it interesting. Maybe they really didn't see anything and Tina was the only witness. But Justin claims he saw two men take Tina out of the cabin and that he covered Sue with the blanket. Hypnosis or not, that is a horrifying scene. And I would not blame him for not saying anything. He was an actual child and he was probably scared of his stepdad, allegedly. That is a theory that makes the most sense to me. But I feel like one of the dangers with a case this bizarre is that eventually everything becomes about the mystery and the conspiracy. I mean, I literally, just proved that because I can't not see the fuckery in all of this. But that does not negate the fact that 4 humans had their lives taken. A 12-year-old girl, her 15-year-old brother, his 17-year-old friend, like just babies, and Sue Sharp, who was only 36 years old. She'd gotten herself and her 5 children out of an abusive marriage, moved across the country, enrolled in school, found work, was trying to build something better for them. And that's how it ended. I hate that. I hate it so much. And since that awful night in 1981, Sheila Sharp has publicly spoken over the years about her lingering pain and frustration. She stated that she would periodically call the sheriff's office only to be told there were no new leads or updates. And in interviews, such as the one she did in People Magazine Investigates, she shared how the trauma caused lasting caution and difficulties in forming personal relationships. But she did express renewed hope when, investigators and special agents took a fresh look at the evidence. So she's pushing for accountability. Her younger brothers, however, Rick and Greg, who were only 5 and 10 at the time, they have maintained a largely private life and have not shared widespread public statements or interviews regarding the case, which, I can't blame them. But if I have learned anything about cold cases like this one, it's that 40 years does not necessarily mean forever. And I think it could be solved. And that, my friends, is the devastating story of the Keddie Cabin murders. These stories never get easier, even older ones like this. And I really have no fun way to segue out of that. It's a really horrific story. I truly hope that Sheila and her brothers have found some sort of peace and are doing okay. But now we need a fun fact. Anyone who's new, I do a fun fact, usually historical silliness, at the end of a true crime case because we need to cleanse the palate. And because I can't give you a brain bath, I choose fun facts. So here's our fun fact for the day. Back in the 18th and 19th century, wealthy Europeans hired people to live in their gardens as decorative hermits. Their entire job was essentially to be unwashed, mysterious, and lurk around the property. They would even build them little homes, like caves, almost called hermitages. Fun to say. And I mean, I don't know, guys. I feel like there's a lot of things I'm thankful no longer exist from this era, but I feel like we got to bring this back. I feel like I'm highly qualified for this position. Here's your hut, become a cryptid. Just unbathed, unshaven in my robe. Sounds delightful, actually. I hate having to shower sometimes. That doesn't mean I have bad hygiene. Okay, I smell fantastic. I shower every day. But it is so much work. You got to wash your hair, your body, shave your legs, and other things. I mean, not everyone does. Some people like it all natural. That's cool. Do you, boo boo? But I feel like showers take so much of my energy every day. It really is a love-hate relationship. And I know I need them to feel better and I am like refreshed afterward, but also so many steps. So many steps. Being a girl is exhausting sometimes. So if anyone wants to hire me as a hermit to live in your yard, I'm game. I don't know. I don't know what the purpose of this was. Was this like a status thing? Hey, I'm rich. Look at my hermit. That's so weird. Uh, anyway, that's our fun fact. Thank you for tuning in today. Be good humans. Become a cryptid if you want. It's your life. And as always, remember to trust your lizard brain. Until next time, goodbye.